True scary stories from Reddit. Trapped in a haunted house with a dark family secret. The sky hung heavy with dark, churning clouds as Eleanor Harper drove down the winding, overgrown path leading to the Harper family mansion. The house loomed ahead, a hulking, decrepit structure that seemed to have absorbed the weight of its tragic history into its very walls. Its once grand facade was now a patchwork of peeling paint, broken shutters, and ivy creeping like veins across its surface. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with intricate patterns, now appeared dull and lifeless, as though the house itself had long since surrendered to despair. Eleanor's car came to a reluctant stop at the cracked stone driveway. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the place she had tried to forget for most of her adult life. The Harper mansion, nestled in the heart of rural Massachusetts, was as much a prison as it was a legacy. Her parents had died here just weeks ago, both under circumstances the coroner had deemed accidental, though Eleanor found that word suspiciously convenient. Pushing aside her apprehension, she stepped out of the car and into the biting wind. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. As she approached the front steps, the ancient wooden door seemed to watch her, its iron knocker shaped like a snarling wolf. She hesitated before turning the key. "This is just a house," she whispered to herself. "Just bricks and wood." But the moment she stepped inside, the air changed, heavier and colder, as though the house was taking her presence into account. The grand foyer was an architectural marvel in its heyday, but time had not been kind. Dust blanketed the mahogany staircase and cobwebs clung to the intricate chandeliers like shrouds. Eleanor ran her fingers along the banister, feeling the grooves where the varnish had worn away. The house was eerily quiet. No distant hum of electricity, no creak of settling wood, just silence. Eleanor began unpacking, but her mind drifted to the purpose of her visit. She was here not just to settle her parents' estate, but to uncover the truth behind the legacy that had haunted her family for generations. The next morning, sunlight struggled through the grime-covered windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Eleanor decided to start clearing out the attic, the place her parents had always forbidden her from exploring as a child. The attic was a labyrinth of forgotten relics, broken furniture, trunks filled with yellowed linens, and stacks of papers that disintegrated at the slightest touch. As she moved further into the space, she noticed something unusual. An ornate chest tucked into the far corner, shrouded in an old quilt. Curiosity piqued. She dragged the chest into the light. It was unlike anything else in the house, carved from dark wood with intricate floral patterns, its iron hinges tarnished but sturdy. The lock was rusted shut, but Eleanor's determination outweighed her trepidation. She found a crowbar among her father's tools and pried it open with a sharp crack. Inside, she found 2 diaries, their leather covers cracked and faded. The first was stamped with the initials M.H., Margaret Harper, her great-grandmother. The second bore the name Samuel Harper, her uncle who had vanished decades ago. Beneath them were scattered photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the mansion, marked with strange symbols. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. These items, hidden away for so long, felt like they carried their own weight of secrets. She picked up Margaret's diary, the leather soft and cold to the touch, and opened it to the first page. To those who find this, the Harper family has thrived on lies, blood, and darkness. What I'm about to recount is not just my story, it is a warning. Eleanor's breath caught. The words seemed to leap off the page, connecting her to a woman she had never met but whose story might explain everything she had ever feared about her family. A faint sound broke her concentration. A whisper, faint and distant, as if the house itself was reacting to her discovery. Eleanor looked around but saw nothing, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in the attic. Story 1: The Hidden Bloodline. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the floor of the attic, the dusty diary of Margaret Harper open in her hands. The old leather cover bore the marks of time, but the ink inside was surprisingly vivid, as though Margaret's words had been preserved by sheer force of will. December 3rd, 1902. Today, I became Mrs. Margaret Harper. The house is grander than I ever imagined. It feels like a dream, one that I pray I never wake from. Margaret's opening words painted a picture of naive optimism. As Eleanor read on, she could feel her ancestors' excitement radiating from the pages. Margaret had been swept off her feet by Jonathan Harper, a wealthy, enigmatic man who had promised her a life of comfort and luxury. But as the entries continued, Margaret's tone shifted. Eleanor turned the brittle pages carefully, her breath catching as she read the lines that followed. The house is beautiful, but its beauty feels hollow. There are rooms Jonathan forbids me to enter, and when I ask why, he simply smiles and says, "Some doors are better left closed." Eleanor's grip on the diary tightened. She could imagine Margaret walking through the halls of the mansion, curiosity and unease warring within her. Margaret described how her joy began to erode as she settled into her new life. The servants, who should have been her allies, avoided her gaze and spoke in whispers. She often found them standing motionless in the corridors, their faces pale, as though listening for something Eleanor suspected she might now recognize: the house itself. One entry stood out. "Last night I woke to the sound of crying. It seemed to echo through the walls, soft and mournful. I followed it, clutching a candle, but the sound vanished as I approached. When I told Jonathan, he dismissed it as my imagination. But I know what I heard." Margaret's growing unease turned to suspicion as Jonathan's behavior became more erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with mud on his boots and a haunted look in his eyes. The diary chronicled her attempts to confront him, only to be met with deflections and evasions. "Jonathan has become a stranger to me. He speaks in riddles, his warmth replaced by a cold, calculating demeanor. I feel as though I am living with a man I do not know." Eleanor paused, her eyes drifting to the attic's dim corners. The atmosphere felt charged, as though Margaret's words had awakened something in the house. The most chilling entry came near the end of the chapter. "There is a room at the end of the east wing that remains locked at all times. I have never seen inside, but I know it holds secrets. One of the maids let slip that no one has entered in years, not even the servants. When I asked her why, she trembled and whispered, 'Because they are still there.' Before I could ask her what she meant, Jonathan appeared, and she fled like a frightened rabbit." Eleanor closed the diary, her hands trembling. She glanced at the attic door, half expecting to see a shadow waiting for her. Margaret's fear was palpable, seeping from the pages like an echo of the past. Driven by the need to understand, Eleanor tucked Margaret's diary under her arm and made her way to the east wing. The house seemed to groan as she descended the attic stairs, each creak of the wood a reminder that she was never truly alone here. The east wing was colder, the air heavier, as though the house was holding its breath. Eleanor followed Margaret's description to a large oak door with an ornate iron lock. She ran her fingers over the carvings, her pulse quickening as she noticed faint scratch marks near the keyhole. She leaned in, pressing her ear to the door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then faintly she heard it, a soft, mournful cry just as Margaret had described. Eleanor stepped back, her heart pounding. The diaries weren't just relics of the past. They were a guide, a map to the Harper family's buried truths. Somewhere, deep inside, she knew that once she unlocked the secrets of this house, there would be no turning back. The East Wing study was nothing short of a fortress. Margaret described in her diary how she discovered it accidentally, one stormy evening when a draft pushed open a hidden door concealed behind a tapestry. Eleanor marveled at the detail as she read, the words pulling her deeper into her great-grandmother's life. Margaret wrote about her first impression of the study. A room steeped in shadows, its air thick with the scent of old paper and varnish. A massive oak desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed documents and ledgers. A single window allowed in just enough light to catch the glint of a silver lockbox sitting conspicuously on the desk. "I should have turned and left," Margaret wrote, "but something compelled me to stay. Perhaps it was the way the house seemed to grow quieter, as though it wanted me to listen." Margaret's description of opening the lockbox was fraught with suspense. The key, she said, had been tucked under a false panel in the desk drawer, as if the house had decided to reveal it to her. Inside the box was an ancient ledger bound in cracked leather, its edges worn smooth by generations of handling. I hesitated before opening it. The lockbox alone had filled me with dread, as though I were about to uncover something not meant for my eyes. But curiosity proved stronger than fear. The ledger's contents were meticulously written in an elegant, flowing script. It chronicled the Harper family's history, but not in the way Margaret expected. Instead of birth and marriage records, it was filled with references to a pact made centuries ago with an enigmatic figure called the benefactor. Eleanor's heart raced as she read Margaret's account of the ledger. The benefactor promised wealth and influence beyond measure in exchange for a single price, the firstborn child of each generation. I stared at the words, willing them to change, to dissolve into nonsense. But they remained, stark and unyielding, a cruel testament to our family's dark bargain. Margaret's growing horror was palpable in her writing. She described pages filled with the names and birth dates of Harper firstborns, each followed by the same chilling notation: vanished before 18. I thought it was a cruel joke at first, some grim fantasy penned by a deranged ancestor. But the dates matched too perfectly, the pattern too deliberate to ignore. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each name a nail in the coffin of my disbelief. Margaret's revelation took on a new urgency when she recounted a conversation with one of the older maids. The woman had been in the family's employ for decades and was privy to its deepest secrets. When I showed her the ledger, she turned pale. "You shouldn't have found this," she whispered, clutching her rosary as though it might shield her. "It's true, all of it. The benefactor comes for what is owed. No one has ever stopped him." Eleanor's breath hitched as she imagined her great-grandmother's despair upon realizing the implications. Margaret was pregnant at the time. Her child, the future heir to the Harper fortune, would be the next victim. The diary recounted Margaret's growing paranoia. She began to notice strange occurrences that she attributed to the benefactor's looming presence. Shadows moved where none should, and faint whispers echoed in empty rooms. The house itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as though it were an accomplice in the pact. Margaret's desperation led her to confront Jonathan, who dismissed her fears as hysteria. "It's just an old story, Margaret," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes betrayed him, darting to the ledger before he could stop himself. I knew then that he was complicit, that he had known all along what our child was destined to face. Eleanor set the diary down, her hands trembling. The air in the attic seemed heavier, the house around her eerily silent. She felt Margaret's anguish as though it were her own, her ancestors' words weaving a thread of shared dread between them. Margaret's final entries hinted at her resolve to defy the curse. "I will not let this house take my child. Whatever the cost, I will break this cycle even if it destroys me in the process." Eleanor closed the diary, her mind racing with questions. Had Margaret succeeded? Was the curse broken? Or had it merely lain dormant, waiting for the next generation to unlock its secrets? Her gaze drifted to the window, where the setting sun bathed the decaying mansion in an ominous red light. Deep down, Eleanor knew the answers would not come easily. The ledger had been a warning, a plea for help that had traveled across time, and she was determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The weight of Margaret's discovery pressed down on her like a vice. She couldn't stay in the mansion, not with the knowledge of the curse threatening her unborn child. Her diary described her frantic efforts to escape, detailing how she packed a small bag of essentials and waited for nightfall to slip away unnoticed. But the mansion had other plans. "I had barely made it past the wrought iron gates when I saw him standing there, his silhouette framed by the pale light of the moon," Margaret wrote, referring to her father-in-law, the family patriarch. His expression was as cold and unyielding as the stone walls of the house behind him. He did not yell or threaten. Instead, his words were laced with a quiet menace that sent chills down Margaret's spine. "You cannot run from this, Margaret," he said, his voice almost gentle. The Pact is unbreakable. It is woven into the very foundation of this family, and no amount of running will change that. Margaret's attempts to reason with him fell on deaf ears. The patriarch revealed his own role in maintaining the pact, explaining that it had secured the family's fortune and power for generations. "Do you think we rose to prominence through hard work alone?" he sneered. "Everything we have, everything we are, is because of the benefactor. To defy him is to condemn us all." The diary painted a harrowing picture of Margaret's entrapment. Her every move was monitored, her letters intercepted, and the few servants who dared show her kindness were swiftly dismissed. As the weeks dragged on, Margaret began to feel the mansion itself closing in on her, its creaking floorboards and whispering walls a constant reminder of her impending doom. Then came the night of the birth. Margaret's diary recounted the pain and terror of labor, but it was the events that followed that burned themselves into Eleanor's mind. Once the child, a boy, was born, the family patriarch and several robed figures emerged from the shadows, carrying torches that cast flickering, malevolent light across the room. Margaret screamed and clung to her child, but they tore him from her arms, their chants filling the air with an otherworldly resonance. "I fought with everything I had, clawing and biting like a wild animal," Margaret wrote, her anguish leaping off the pages. "But they were too strong, and I was too weak." The robed figures carried the baby down to a secret chamber beneath the house, accessed through a hidden passage in the basement. Margaret, driven by a mix of maternal instinct and raw desperation, followed them, despite her exhaustion. The chamber was a grotesque sight. An altar carved with ancient symbols stood at its center, surrounded by candles that burned with an unnatural blue flame. The air was thick with the scent of blood and incense, and the walls seemed to pulse as though alive. Margaret's diary described her horror as the patriarch began a ritual, invoking the benefactor in a guttural, unearthly language. "I could feel the air around me grow colder, as if the very life was being drained from the room," she wrote. "I knew then that I had no choice but to act." Summoning every ounce of strength, Margaret sabotaged the ritual. She overturned the altar, extinguished the candles, and screamed a prayer to whatever force might be listening. For a moment it seemed as though she had succeeded. The patriarch and the robed figures recoiled, their chants faltering. But then, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. The blue flames reignited, brighter and fiercer than before, and Margaret's baby vanished before her eyes. The final entries in the diary were a heart-wrenching descent into despair. Margaret described how the cries of her lost child echoed through the mansion every night, a constant reminder of her failure. "I hear him in the walls, in the very bones of this cursed house," she wrote. "His wails pierce my soul, and I know that he is trapped, just as I am." Margaret's last words were a plea to anyone who might one day find her diary. If you are reading this, know that the curse still lingers. Do not trust the walls, do not trust the shadows, and above all, do not let the benefactor claim another soul. Eleanor closed the diary, her chest tight with a mixture of grief and anger. She felt Margaret's pain as if it were her own, her ancestors' defiance igniting a spark of determination within her. The cries Margaret had described, the same cries Eleanor had heard every night since she arrived, were no longer just an unsettling mystery. They were a call for justice, a call she could not ignore. As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would uncover the full truth of the curse and end it once and for all. The mansion, with all its secrets and horrors, would no longer hold its power over the Harper family. Story 2: The Forgotten Heir. Eleanor turned the brittle pages of the second diary, its edges frayed and ink faded from age. It belonged to her uncle, Samuel Harper, a name she barely recognized. His words spilled out like a haunting echo, carrying her back to his childhood in the mansion, an existence shrouded in shadows, secrets, and silences. Samuel described growing up in the Harper home, where every hallway seemed alive with whispers and every room held the weight of things left unsaid. "My parents were strict and unyielding," Samuel wrote, "but it wasn't their sternness that scared me. It was the house itself, the way it seemed to breathe around me. There were nights I swore I wasn't alone, even when no one else was there. Among the many oddities of his childhood, one stood out: the whispers of a forgotten heir. It was never spoken of directly, only hinted at during hurried conversations between servants or when a family member's voice faltered mid-sentence. The forgotten heir was more myth than memory, Samuel explained. No one would admit to knowing who or what it was, but the unease on their faces told me enough. It was something to fear. The diary's tone shifted one stormy night, a memory that Samuel recounted in vivid, chilling detail. Thunder rumbled outside the mansion, shaking its decaying walls. Rain lashed against the windows and the old house groaned under the weight of the storm. Samuel, barely 10 years old, was tucked in bed, trying to drown out the eerie creaks and moans that echoed through the house. But then he heard it. Footsteps. They were light but deliberate, pacing just outside his bedroom door. Heart pounding, Samuel called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all he could hear was the storm raging outside. Curiosity got the better of me, he admitted in the diary. I shouldn't have left my bed, but something compelled me to follow. He stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The footsteps resumed, leading him further down the corridor to a part of the house he had never explored. It was there, at the end of the hall, that Samuel discovered a door he had never noticed before. It was small and unassuming, tucked away, in a corner where the shadows seemed to cling the thickest. The door was cold to the touch, he wrote, as if it had been sealed in ice, untouched for years. With trembling hands, Samuel turned the rusted knob, and the door creaked open to reveal a hidden nursery. The room was a time capsule of neglect. Cobwebs hung from the corners, dust blanketed every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. An old crib sat in the center of the room, its wood splintered and its mattress stained. But what caught Samuel's attention were the walls. The faded pastel paint was marred by scratches, deep gouges that looked like they had been made. In desperation, scrawled across the walls in uneven, frantic handwriting were the words, "Save me." Samuel's breath hitched as he stepped closer to the crib. Inside, he found a small, tattered blanket, its edges chewed as if by tiny teeth. "I felt a chill run down my spine," Samuel wrote, not from the cold but from the overwhelming sense of sorrow that filled the room. It was as if the walls themselves were crying out in agony. As he stood there, frozen in fear, a faint sound reached his ears. The soft, unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It was coming from the crib. Samuel's instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The crying grew louder, more desperate, until it was a wail that seemed to echo through his very soul. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The room fell silent, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. Samuel turned to leave, but as he did, he caught sight of something in the corner of his eye, a shadow, small and childlike, darting across the room. "I ran then," he admitted in the diary. "I ran as fast as my legs could carry me back to the safety of my bed, but I knew I would never truly feel safe again." Samuel's encounter with the hidden nursery marked the beginning of his obsession with uncovering the truth about the forgotten heir. The diary detailed his attempts to ask questions, to pry secrets from his parents and the servants, but he was met with cold denials and stern warnings. "The more I pushed, the more they shut me out," he wrote, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I couldn't forget the cries, the scratches, or the shadow that followed me back to my room. Eleanor closed the diary, her hands shaking. The story felt all too real, the vivid descriptions pulling her into Samuel's memories as if she had been there herself. She glanced at the hidden door she had discovered earlier that week, now locked, tight. The urge to open it burned within her, but fear held her back. Somewhere in the house the wind howled, carrying with it a faint sound, a baby's cry. Eleanor swallowed hard, her resolve wavering, but she knew she couldn't ignore the forgotten heir's plea for help, just as Samuel couldn't. The mansion's secrets were far from buried, and Eleanor was determined to unearth them all, no matter the cost. Eleanor pressed her fingers to the aged leather of Samuel Harper's diary, its pages trembling as if echoing the harrowing truths it contained. As she read further, Samuel's words wove a web of betrayal, loss, and buried secrets. They said the mansion was built on strong foundations, Samuel had written, but they never told me it was held together by lies. Driven by his chilling discovery of the hidden nursery, Samuel began searching for answers, determined to uncover the truth behind the forgotten heir. He combed through old family trunks, searched behind dusty bookshelves, and pried open locked drawers. His persistence paid off when he stumbled upon a bundle of aged letters concealed within a false bottom of an ornate writing desk in the study. The letters, yellowed with time and brittle at the edges, revealed a scandal that had long been buried. Written in hurried, anguished handwriting, they spoke of an illegitimate heir, a child born to one of the Harper patriarchs, and an unknown woman. This child was never meant to exist, one letter confessed. The shame would ruin us, unravel everything we have worked so hard to build. They must be kept away, out of sight, out of mind. The letters implied that the child had been sent away to an orphanage to preserve the family's reputation. Yet as Samuel sifted through the correspondence, an unsettling detail caught his attention. A later letter suggested the child had not remained in the orphanage as originally planned. I received word that the arrangement was not as discreet as promised, the letter read. The child is too dangerous to leave in the care of strangers. Bring them back to the house, but ensure they are kept hidden. No one must ever know. Samuel felt his blood run cold. If the child had been brought back to the mansion, where were they now? The whispers that had plagued him throughout his childhood began to grow louder, more insistent. They seemed to follow him wherever he went, murmuring just beyond the edge of comprehension. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, Samuel admitted in the diary, but the voices were real. They weren't in my head. They were in the house. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, Samuel followed the whispers. They led him through the mansion's labyrinthine halls to a section of the house long forgotten, its doors sealed and its windows boarded. The air was heavier there, as if the walls were saturated with sorrow, Samuel wrote. And yet, I felt drawn to it, as if something, or someone, was calling to me. In the darkness, Samuel caught fleeting glimpses of movement. The corner of a shadow, the rustle of fabric, the faintest outline of a figure. His heart pounded as he turned a corner and froze. Before him stood the ghostly figure of a child. The apparition was pale and translucent, its hollow eyes filled with tears. The child wore a tattered gown, its hem frayed and dirt-streaked, and clutched a small threadbare teddy bear. "Help me," the child whispered, its voice trembling with despair. Samuel's legs locked in place, his breath hitching in his throat. He wanted to speak, to ask the child who they were, but the words wouldn't come. The child turned and began to walk away, its form flickering like a dying flame. Samuel forced himself to follow, his fear outweighed by his desperate need for answers. The child led him to a door he had never seen before, its surface warped and its frame covered in strange, jagged symbols. As Samuel reached for the handle, a sudden force threw him backward. The door remained shut, the symbols glowing faintly, as if to ward him off. The child turned back to him, tears streaming down its ethereal face. "They won't let me leave," the child said, its voice barely audible. "They won't let me go." The figure vanished, leaving Samuel alone in the suffocating darkness. He wrote in his diary that night, his trembling hand barely able to hold the pen. "The forgotten heir is no mere legend. They are real. They are here, and they are suffering." Samuel spent the following days in a feverish haze, piecing together the truth from the fragments he had uncovered. He came to believe that the child had been brought back to the mansion and kept in isolation, a victim of the Harper family's relentless pursuit of perfection and reputation. "Their silence damned an innocent soul," Samuel wrote bitterly. "And now, that soul lingers, trapped in this house of horrors, crying for a justice they will never receive. As Eleanor read his words, she felt a cold shiver course through her. Samuel's torment resonated deeply, stirring an ache in her heart. The ghostly whispers in the mansion were no longer a mystery. They were a cry for help, an unending plea for salvation. Eleanor looked up from the diary, her gaze drifting to the shadows that seemed to dance along the edges of the room. The weight of the mansion's secrets pressed down on her, and she knew she couldn't turn away. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned to the final pages of Samuel's diary. The inked words seemed to bleed desperation, fear, and a lingering weight of guilt. This chapter was not just an account, it was a warning. The whispers have grown louder, their voices tangled with grief and fury. Samuel wrote, "I can no longer ignore the truth. This house is cursed, not by superstition, but by the monstrous deeds of our bloodline." Samuel's determination to uncover the story of the forgotten heir reached a breaking point. Armed with the knowledge from the letters and the haunting encounters with the ghost, he confronted his father, Edward Harper, the austere patriarch of the family. The confrontation took place in the grand study, its towering bookshelves and dim lamplight casting long, oppressive shadows. Samuel's voice wavered but held firm as he demanded answers. The forgotten heir, who were they? He asked. "What did you do to them?" Edward's face darkened, his cold gaze betraying a flicker of unease. He poured himself a glass of whiskey with deliberate calm, but his hand trembled as he brought it to his lips. "Some truths are better left buried, Samuel," Edward replied. "What good will it do to dredge up the past?" But Samuel refused to relent, his anger boiling over. "You left a child to suffer alone and abandoned in this house. That ghost won't let us forget. They're demanding justice." At Samuel's words, Edward's composure shattered. He slammed the glass onto the desk, his voice rising in a mixture of fury and guilt. "You don't understand," Edward bellowed. "I had no choice. The family demanded it. That child's existence was a stain on our name, a scandal that could have destroyed us." Samuel's heart clenched as Edward recounted the harrowing truth. The forgotten heir, a child born of an affair, had been brought back to the mansion in secret. To maintain the illusion of a perfect family, Edward had ordered the child confined to the hidden nursery. "We told ourselves it was for the best," Edward said, his voice breaking. "But the child grew weaker, sicker. By the time I realized the harm we'd done, it was too late. They died, alone, in that cursed room." The weight of Edward's confession hung in the air, suffocating and final. Samuel's fury gave way to horror. The whispers, the ghostly cries, the figure of the child, they were echoes of a life stolen too soon, a soul trapped in torment. That night, Samuel's worst fears came to life. The mansion seemed alive with malevolence. The walls groaned, the air thickened, and the whispers rose to an anguished crescendo. Samuel tried to sleep, but an eerie glow from the hall drew him from his bed. He followed the light to the hidden nursery, the door now ajar. Inside, the room was transformed. The Eerie crib was intact, rocking gently as though an unseen force cradled an invisible infant. The words "Save me," once scrawled faintly on the walls, now blazed like fire. The ghost of the forgotten heir stood at the center of the room, their spectral form more solid than before. Their gaze was fixed on Samuel, their eyes filled with an indescribable mix of sorrow and rage. "They're coming for him," the ghost said, their voice cold and haunting. Before Samuel could respond, a scream echoed through the mansion. It was Edward. Samuel raced toward the sound, his heart pounding. He found his father in the basement, drawn there by the ghost's vengeful presence. Edward was on his knees, pleading with the apparition that loomed over him. "I'm sorry," Edward cried. "I didn't mean for this to happen. Please forgive me." The ghost showed no mercy. They raised a hand, and the room was engulfed in a blinding light. When the light faded, both Edward and the ghost were gone. The basement was silent, the air heavy with finality. Samuel returned to his room, his mind racing. He wrote feverishly in his diary, capturing the events of the night in vivid detail. "Forgotten heir has claimed their justice," he wrote, "but their soul remains restless. This house is their prison, and their wrath will not cease until the truth is acknowledged and the cycle is broken." Samuel left the mansion the next morning, his resolve steeled by his harrowing experiences. In his final entry, he addressed future generations of the Harper family. "To those who inherit this cursed house, heed my warning. The forgotten heir will not be silenced. Face the truth of our family's sins or suffer the consequences of their wrath. Only by bringing their story to light can this torment end." As Eleanor closed the diary, the room seemed to exhale, as though the mansion itself had been holding its breath. The story of the forgotten heir was harrowing, yet it filled her with a sense of purpose. She had to finish what Samuel had started. For the ghost, for her family, and for herself. The mansion's dark legacy would no longer remain hidden in the shadows. Eleanor stood before the crumbling mansion, the weight of her family's dark history pressing heavily on her chest. The words from the diaries, Margaret's fear, Samuel's warnings, had woven a web of terror and regret. And now, standing in the heart of it all, Eleanor understood the full extent of the curse that had haunted the Harper family for generations. The truth was undeniable. The pact that had been sealed by her ancestors with the benefactor had cursed them all. Their wealth, their success, and their lives had come at the steep price of a child's soul, each firstborn every generation marked for sacrifice. The ghost of the forgotten heir, the cries of lost children had been the consequences of a twisted bargain made long ago, one that Eleanor's family had perpetuated for decades. As she connected the dots, Margaret's despair, Samuel's tragic discoveries, the vengeful specter haunting the mansion, it all became clear. The mansion itself seemed to be alive, reacting violently as she uncovered its secrets. The walls groaned, the ground trembled beneath her feet, and a cold chill swept through the house as if it was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the final move. The diary entries had led her to this moment, this realization that only by confronting the truth could the curse be broken. Eleanor moved purposefully toward the hidden door she had found earlier, the one that led to the ritual chamber. The air grew thick with anticipation, the shadows closing in on her as she descended into the depths of the mansion. There, in the center of the chamber, lay the remnants of the ritual, a cracked altar, dark symbols etched into the stone, and a lingering presence of forgotten souls. This was where it all began. The pact had been made here, and it was here that it would end. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the chamber, searching for a way to undo the horrors that had plagued her family for so long. The clues in the diaries had given her the pieces of the puzzle, but now she had to trust herself to complete it. She gathered the old relics from around the room, each one an artifact tied to the rituals of the past. Her breath hitched as she recalled Margaret's desperate attempt to sabotage the ritual, her Uncle Samuel's final warning to the future generations. The knowledge she had gained was enough. It had to be enough. With trembling hands, Eleanor began the incantation written in the final pages of the diaries. Words she never thought she would utter, words that would forever change the course of her life. The chamber seemed to hum with energy as the ritual took form, and then the air shifted. The ground trembled beneath her, the walls of the chamber shaking as the mansion's dark history came alive. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, faint, translucent forms of children long sacrificed, their eyes filled with sadness and rage. Their voices, echoing like a chorus of pain, filled the air. Eleanor's voice wavered as she continued the incantation. "I free you, I free all of you. Rest now and be at peace." The ghosts of the sacrificed children slowly materialized, their expressions softening as they gathered around Eleanor. In an ethereal glow, they forgave her. The weight of the curse that had bound them for so long lifted, and the air grew still, the mansion falling into an unnatural quiet. Then, with one final resounding crack, the mansion began to collapse. The walls crumbled, the floors caved in, and the foundation shook as though the house itself was finally giving in to the sins of the past. Eleanor stood at the heart of it, untouched by the destruction, as if the mansion's very spirit was being cleansed. The Harper family's dark legacy was ending, finally. As the dust settled and the ruins of the mansion lay in silence, Eleanor stood amidst the wreckage, breathing in the fresh air of freedom. The ghosts were gone, the curse had been broken, and the mansion that had once held so many painful memories was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. In the ashes of her family's dark history, Eleanor found herself. She had uncovered the truth, broken the chains that had bound her family for generations, and freed the souls of those long trapped. There was no going back now. As she walked away from the ruins, her heart felt light. No longer would she be a prisoner of the past, haunted by the sins of those who came before her. She had found her own path, one that was free from the shadows of her ancestors. Eleanor's journey had been a painful one, but it was also one of healing. Confronting the hidden truths of her family had been the only way to break the generational cycle of pain, to put the past to rest and move forward into a future of her own choosing. With the mansion in ruins, Eleanor's life was finally her own. A new beginning awaited her, free from the darkness that had once threatened to consume her.